One thing that drives me crazy is going up to a beautiful location like this slot canyon and coming back with raw exposures that look like this with clipped shadows and blown highlights. What's up guys, this is Greg Benz, and in this tutorial I'll show you can easily fix a problem like this by using luminosity masks to blend multiple exposures together. What we're going to need will be a couple of different exposures. I have this brighter exposure that gives me shadow detail, and I have a second darker exposure that I've shot with a faster shutter speed, and that's going to capture the highlight detail. We're then going to combine these two together to address these problems. The first step, of course, is going to be processing the raw files, and I've already gone ahead and done that with these two green virtual copies. So if you look at this first one here, I made a couple of very simple adjustments to bring out more detail in the image. I've increased the exposure, shadows, and blacks to restore all this detail in the shadows. And then I've also made a slight adjustment to the saturation just to bring out a little bit of color. So pretty simple, straightforward adjustments. In the second exposure that was a little darker for highlight detail, I've made a more complex series of adjustments. I've adapted the exposure, highlights, shadows, and blacks, as well as adding a little bit of clarity and vibrance to the image. And then down in the split toning, I've warmed the highlights and cooled the shadows, also gone down to the camera calibration and increased the saturation sliders for the blue and red. Now, I'm not going to go through all the reasons and details of these because I have other tutorials that cover raw processing, and see below this video for links to them if you want to understand how I process my raw files. But in a nutshell, we've got one image process for the highlight detail, one for the shadow, and we're going to send both over to Photoshop. So I'm just simply going to export them. Now that we have the images open in Photoshop, we can see that they are both open as two separate documents. We need to put them into the same document so we can blend them together. We also need to align them. If you watch the details here in the two versions, there's a little bit of a shift there because I didn't shoot on a tripod for this image. I didn't have the opportunity. This is a handheld photograph, so I need to align them as well. We can take care of all of that in one quick step by clicking Pre-Blend in Lumenzia. We're going to choose to sort the dark image on top. We'll make sure that we align our layers to deal with that movement between the frames. We'll add our black mask for the blending and click on Blend Documents. When prompted, I'm just going to close my source documents. I don't need them anymore. I just want the blended output. You can see we now have the dark version on top with a black layer mask ready to begin the blending. It's also protected the pixels, so I can't paint on these pixels. I'm going to be painting on the layer mask. And if I shift click this mask, we can see the darker exposure is properly aligned here. So the alignment is successful, and you kind of get a sense of that because of this white edge. That's telling you that this image has been moved. So I actually want to crop that. I'm going to hit C for the crop tool and just drag in from the lower corner here just a tiny bit like so. Go ahead and click the check mark to get rid of that little white pixel. And now we want to start blending this darker exposure into the image in the areas that are highlighted. So if we paint white on this layer mask, we reveal this darker exposure. And if we specifically paint white in the areas that are bright here in the highlights, then we'll just be restoring the darker exposure in the highlights and fixing the highlights. The challenge is we can't paint with a freehand brush. If we try and paint along these edges, it's going to be very hard. It's going to spill over, and the shadow side of these caves is going to get dark. It'll look funny. Well, we could try and do something like W for the quick select, and in doing so, you end up with a lot of funny edges. Even as good as that looks, the edges are not going to be very clean. And so this is not the approach you want to take. You can see, for example, here, it's got little funny bits, and it's really going to fall apart if you zoom in close for a print. So let's deselect that. Instead, what we want to do is make a selection based on the pixels themselves, selecting the brightest pixels the most, and we don't want to select these darker pixels. That is the basis of a luminosity selection. It serves as a stencil to help us paint on just the highlights in this image and reveal the darker exposure where we need it. To create one, we'll click on the L button in Lumenzia, creates these orange layers, which serve as a preview that let you interactively choose the best version of this preview. And what you're looking at is white is going to be selected and black is going to be protected. So all this bright stuff can be painted with a white brush, and that serves to bias the paint and what we reveal towards these highlight areas while protecting the shadows. Of course, some of this cavernous area is still selected with that dark gray. It's a little bit selected and it can be painted. You can, of course, change these previews interactively. So if I make my darker exposure visible, that's the basis for a lights 1.5. And because it's darker, the whole selection becomes less because we don't have as much highlight in this version. And now we have a much better separation of the highlight areas and these shadows that we want to protect. I could also drag this slider and try and refine it further, but I don't think I need to. So I'm going to stick with lights 1.5 instead of going to some other lights mask. I think that's a good choice. And what I'm going to do now is convert it to a selection by clicking the cell button in Lumenzia. Once I do that, we don't see any marching ants because the Lumenzia preference for hide marching ants is on. And I do recommend that because marching ants are really very confusing and not very useful for luminosity selections. But you know that you have an active selection because the cell button is lit up green. We can now click on our black layer mask to make that the target for our painting. I'm going to hit B to make my paintbrush active. I've got white as my foreground paint. I have high opacity and low flow, which is a great way to begin painting. And now as I paint, the paint is not going to spill over into the dark cavernous areas above. It's going to be revealed in the brighter highlight areas there in the distant far wall of the slot canyon. And I just kind of brush and let go a few times to help reveal more and more, because the selection is not 100%. You need a few brush strokes to reveal it. But as we do this, we're restoring a lot of highlight detail. And if you're paying close attention, you notice something's a little bit off here. And that is these shadow areas aren't really as dark as they should be. The problem is if we take a look at the layer mask, Alt click on the layer mask, you can see the highlight areas got painted, but these shadow areas are a little bit protected. We didn't want to paint these shadows. And so therefore these shadows also got protected. And since they didn't get revealed from the darker layer, they didn't get darkened. And if we think about that, that means we darkened the bright stuff and the dark stuff didn't really brighten. So everything got closer together in value and we lost some contrast. What we want to do is essentially paint these areas in white, because all we need the luminosity selection for is this tricky edge. This stuff down below, you can freehand paint that because there's no difficult edge. So I want to just paint in these little shadow areas a little bit and then fill in the bottom. An easy way to do that is to just either keep brushing here, and it could take a while because that shadows area is really protected, or we can increase our selection. So I'm just going to go and paint a little bit more here to just get a better sense of some of the shadow areas. So I just see that here. And in fact, let's take a look at the image side by side, both the layer mask and the blended image. It's very helpful to see both at the same time. If you click split in Lumenzia, that's what you get. You see the layer mask here and the blended image down below. So what I want to do is take our luminosity selection and tell it it's okay to completely paint in these areas. So we can add to our existing selection. I'm going to hit W for the quick select, or just click on the quick select here. Make sure it's in the additive mode, which you can do by holding down Shift. And now as we click and drag, you see the luminosity selection immediately started to show with those funny ants. And then as I drag over these areas, it's filling it out, and I'm doing it right on the layer mask. So it's using this higher quality layer mask to add to things. And so that is going to give us a better selection along these edges. Make sure I get this one last little bit. And now I can brush in these areas, and I'm not worried about ruining the edge. I've already created it, and I'm not going to paint as aggressively near the edges. This just helps me fill in the middle here. In fact, I'll grab a little bit more. And now I'm going to hit Command H to hide the ants, hitting B for my brush. Now when I paint here, I can fill in these areas. I'm going to shrink my brush a little bit so I don't paint too much on the edges there. But as I paint and let go, notice that the shadow details here improve quite a bit in the blended version down below because I'm filling in those shadows. So with that, that's probably all I need to look at the mask for to see that one little transition. So I'm going to close that, and I want to fill in the rest down below. So I'm going to hit Control or Command D to deselect, use a larger brush, and just freehand now, I no longer need that luminosity selection, paint in the rest to just allow me to complete the exposure blend down below. And at this point, the blending is really done. We've gone from before to after. I see a little bit of a gap in the middle and here. So always good to check your mask. I don't think it matters too much in this case, but always good to check that. But you can see how much we've improved that image already with that blending. And at this stage, I'm going to shift click on the second layer, put these into a group, and just rename this to blend to help isolate it from the rest of the work, because at this point I would like to finish this image, but we're done with the exposure blending. What I'm thinking about now is I'd like to bring more attention to this part of the rock here. So I probably want to dodge this rock and reveal especially the highlight lit edges of this rock. I'd like to darken some of this top edge, kind of vignette it a bit to again further bring attention down here. And then this midground has a lot of color variability. There's kind of an orange, a yellow, there's this sort of red tone, then there's kind of a pinkish tone here. I'd like to maybe uniformly apply a color across this, not so much that I lose the color variation, but just reduce it, and that should further improve the image. So let's begin with the dodging and burning down below here. I'll click the dodge button in Lumenzia. I'm going to choose to use a transparent pixel layer in the default soft light blend mode. And now if I were to begin to brush with my white paintbrush, I would lighten everything. And if I do that, it's not going to look very nice. Let's hit Control Z to undo that. What I want to do instead is just brush on the highlights. So we need another luminosity selection to do that. I'm going to click on L. I think the default Lights 1.5 does a nice job, but again, you can move the slider around and try and figure out what you think works best. I'm going to stick with this 1.5 and click Cell to make that my active luminosity selection. So now you can see the cell button's green again. Now when I brush, it's guiding my paint to be a little bit more precise. And that was pretty quick and subtle, but if we look before and after, see how that nicely brings attention where I want in the image. And I wasn't paying attention, so I've moved my dodge and burn layer in the blend. I'm just going to drag it up above, keep it out of my blend group, which doesn't change the edit, but it's just visually a little simpler to look at. And so we've got that nice adjustment there, bringing attention where we want it. If you ever want to evaluate what you've done here, see it more closely, you can click on this dodge button. You can see how it's lit yellow when the dodge burn layer is active. And you have this option now to visualize the selected layer. And it shows it here where you can see this slightly lighter area is where we've painted white through the luminosity selection onto the dodge burn layer to brighten those areas. And notice there's, for example, a little bit of some painting over the back edge there. If I wanted to get rid of that, I could do something like hit E for my eraser. I'm just going to hit Command D to get rid of my selection. And I could just kind of go in here and just remove that with my eraser. If I thought that was a problem area, I can clean up those edges. So it's nice to look at the dodge burn visually. You can edit it and see those little issues, and then just click dodge again to reload the updated adjustment there. So now we have this dodge burn adjustment and ready to move forward next to this color variability. To make it more uniform, I'm going to use a single color in color blend mode and paint over these areas. So we can do that by Control or Command clicking the solid fill adjustment in Lumenzia, which gives us a solid color in color blend mode. And now sample the color we want, probably using something like a 3x3 or 5x5 sample size. Just pick up that orange color, say okay, and now you see it washed across the entire image. Of course, we don't want it everywhere. We just want a little bit in the right places. So let's add a black layer mask by Alt-clicking mask. When you Alt-click, you get the opposite. You get a black mask instead of a white mask. And now I'm gonna hit B for my brush, shrink it down a little bit, and I'm going to take my flow down to probably 1%, really soft and subtle. I don't really need a luminosity selection because I don't care about the color going into the highlights or shadows. I just care about it going in this zone. In this case, I'm going to hit W for quick select because I don't need a very precise edge. This will be just fine, but I do want to make sure I'm roughly targeting the areas that I want to go here. And now hitting B for my brush, Command H to hide the ants. Just go and brush a little bit of that orange in here and here. And you know, again, I'm painting with white to reveal this orange color that went from before to after. You can see how it just made that color a bit more uniform. And if that's too much, we can dial it back. We'll just take the opacity down to maybe 67%, maybe go down to 50 or so, and just see how that just simplifies the color a little bit, helps the viewer's eye go where you want it, as opposed to dragging it up to these areas here that aren't really the most important part of the image. It's nice that they have color, but that's not the main point that I'm trying to communicate with this edit. So now that we've done that, I think we can go ahead and maybe move to add a little bit more color in this foreground here, which I feel like is a bit washed out. This is a great place to do something like use a vibrance adjustment. So if I just go and add a new vibrance layer, bring the vibrance up, and you can see that my quick select was active and I turned that into layer mask. I didn't mean to do that. So let's go and just delete that. I should have deselected first. And now you see this vibrance showing through. And of course, it's doing nice things for the highlights, but the shadows are just too much. I don't really want to bring up more vibrance in the shadows. They're already saturated. It's the highlights that are missing that color. So this is another great place. We could use a luminosity mask. We could go and add a black mask, load up a lights 1.5 selection, paint through it just like we did with dodge and burn, just like we did with the blending, However, every time we add a layer mask, you're making the file a little bit bigger. And if you don't need to do that, there's a better approach, one that's more flexible and doesn't make your file any bigger, and that is blend if. Blend if support is built right into Lumensia, and if you just simply shift click on a preview, you go straight to adding a blend if. You can also change the panel mode to if under, and then every time you click on one of those buttons, you get a blend if, but just holding shift is the easiest and fastest way to do it if you do this a lot like I do. And you can see now it says blend if L1.5. So there's a blend if that's been added to the layer that restricts it to the highlights. If I hit Command or Control Z to just toggle before and after, you see that the adjustment is no longer hammering those shadows, but it is still adding some nice color where it needs here. These color areas are just subtly getting improved. If you have a hard time visualizing what's going on, it can be challenging because blend if does not natively have a way of showing you what it does, but it's basically a hidden layer mask. If I click the if button in Lumensia, you get this overlay, and everything that's in green here is showing you that's what's being adjusted. So all these top areas here are getting a lot more vibrance. These highlights are getting vibrance, but the shadows here and the shadows in the rock here, they're not being adjusted by this. And we can, of course, use the slider here in Lumensia and go and say, hey, I want more by making it less restrictive or maybe tighter to just these highlights here. I think something around probably lights 1.5 is going to be a great blend if. So I'm going to stick with that, allow it to blend over a little bit in the shadow areas, but not really very much. Click if. So we see this, and now just kind of look before and after, and you see how it just subtly improves some of that color there. Not too much, but just enough to unify that and strengthen that part of the image. So next, I'm going to go and try and vignette these outer edges. If I hit L for my lasso tool, I can draw a rough selection around where I'd like a vignette in the image. And when I click the vignette button in Lumensia, it's going to naturally darken the areas outside of the selection, and it's going to soften this selection so it will naturally be feathered. So I'll just click vignette, and you can see now we get this nice vignette that darkens the edges. Now, we've worked hard to bring back shadow detail, and I'm not sure I want to necessarily remove all that shadow detail, so I could potentially put some sort of a blend if on this and further constrain things. So if I hit perhaps L, and sorry, let's cancel that. I want to shift click L for a blend if. And you can see from before to after how that has really minimized how much it's vignetting there in those areas. And it's not really doing a whole lot right now. So that is too restrictive. If I bring this slider up to 0, now we see it starting to darken these areas. And now we have this subtle vignette like this that just is bringing it down a little bit. So it's a more advanced vignette that tones down some of these brighter areas on the edges without removing the shadow detail. And again, if you want to visualize, you can click on if to see exactly where the image is being adjusted. And of course, it's not just the areas that the blend if is hitting, but the layer mask itself affects it. So you can see it's these outer areas that the blend if is adjusting there. And we can now alt click the visibility icon to see before and after just how substantially we've improved this image. Be sure to click the links I have to other tutorials here that explain parts of this edit we didn't get to in full, such as the raw processing that I use for images like this.